Welcome back to the podcast. My name's Tim Gordon.
And my name's Joann Steinwachs.
Today on our podcast, we have a much requested topic talking about the treatment of ACT in group settings. How do you do ACT with groups? And we have two fantastic guests, Darrah Westrup and Joann Wright, co-authors on Learning ACT for Group Treatment. But also, Darrah wrote Advanced ACT.
Yes, which we're going to be talking about for
and
sure.
then I will show you our Learning ACT for Group Treatment.
Yes, very
Actually,
nice.
Hold it up a little higher, Joann. That's a great photo of you.
Yeah. You're evil. It begins. Oh, God.
Welcome to the podcast, you two.
Yeah, and the other thing we should mention is both Darrah and Joann are both our peer-reviewed ACT trainers and ACT fellows. I mean, that's kind of an amazing achievement too.
Yeah, it's a pretty high honor.
It's a pretty high honor.
Joann is an ACT fellow, just to correct. I am not. So I want Joann to get full credit there.
Oh, okay.
Well, thank
If you
you.
want to bow that on me, Joann, that's fine.
And we are going to have Joann confusion on this podcast, just so you all know.
Yes,
We will
Joann
have
Wright, Joann Steinwachs.
Joann confusion, and also I am in downtown Chicago, and the L train runs right past my office. So please excuse me if you hear some odd sounds in the background.
Yeah, it's not Tim heavy breathing into a mic.
Although
Not this
sometimes.
time.
Oh, God.
Or you could just imagine that we're doing the podcast on the L train.
Right?
That might be a fun way to picture it, right? Just four friends hanging out, commuting into work.
Right? Yeah.
I like
Making
that.
bad jokes.
So before we get rolling into our kind of full-blown conversation, I wanted to just start with a really quick update, because we have had several people write in, tweeting us, asking us to specifically talk about ACT for groups. And one of the things that I was really curious about, the two of you know that I read your book, that I absolutely love the book, is there's that L train. Oh, it's such a subtle sound. It's actually kind of nice. It's just a little.
Yeah, it kind of is. We're in a city. We live in real cities, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Except for Darrah. She doesn't live in a real city.
But one of the questions that I wanted to ask, just to kind of get the ball rolling, is how you see group work like evolving in your practice over time. Because I think that group work can be incredibly intimidating to people who are learning ACT, or to new clinicians, let alone to people who their day job is, let's say, seeing individual clients. And I just wanted to see if you could give us kind of an intro perspective on how you see group work evolving in your practice, because it's not a natural thing that most people just kind of fall into.
Well, go ahead, Joann.
I was going to tell you to go ahead. We both wanted to answer at the same time. I think as I've been training clinicians to do ACT in groups, one thing that I noticed going from starting and evolving is it's the fluidity of the core processes coming together, and that process level of doing groups is something that takes time to evolve. And so new clinicians, I will notice a lot of times will kind of want to stick to a core process for a day, or have that be the center of group. So it's like it's diffusion day, and so we're going to do that, and have some difficulty pulling in the other core processes as they show up in their room. So that's
We're noticing that they are showing up in the room, or acknowledging that they're showing up, right?
right. And
Yeah.
the ability to see, to catch them as they show up.
Yeah.
I can totally relate to that. Like, I've had that sense, like, no, wait a minute, that seems like that would be something that's more of an acceptance thing we're supposed to be doing. For real, like.
But we're doing diffusion.
Yeah. Right.
I think my experience was a little backward, Tim, because I did ACT in groups long before I ever did ACT individually.
Really?
Yeah, because I went straight from getting my finishing my postdoc into VA Palo Alto in a residential treatment program. And we brought ACT into that program. And so that was I had done an ACT dissertation, was familiar with it, but actually doing the therapy was in a group first.
That was how you got into clinical work. That was your first step.
I had done clinical work previously, but with ACT, it was in a group setting in a residential. Yeah.
So then, Darrah,
I should mention that my What?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying that I was curious then how did you translate it from group to individual?
Yeah.
You know, it was a little tough, as you know. I say this all the time, that for me, ACT in groups is ACT on steroids.
Yeah.
It's so potent and so powerful, and that the means to make clinical gains are so rich that the individual work felt a little less exciting to me for a bit. Maybe that's still the case, but
Yeah.
so much going on in groups.
Darrah, you wanted to say something about your co-leader?
Well, yeah, I just thought that I might mention that I started that process of doing group work right alongside Robin Walzer. So that assisted my learning curve, certainly.
Yeah. Wow. So just for our podcast listeners' reference, like that was not a softball question. I didn't know, Darrah, that you had started in groups and that Joann, you had later started groups. This is a really cool, like interesting dynamic. And I don't know if other folks can relate to this, but I love that statement that like how exciting and how the group work can feel like ACT on steroids. Because I have the exact same experience where I've now been having most of my clients, when they go into like a maintenance phase, join our group, because the group is so, I don't even know how to describe it. It's so much more evocative. It seems like we get so much more done.
Yeah.
Very alive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And along with that, you have, the opportunities to watch that human interaction, to watch them interact with each other and what comes up for them in vivo. And at the same time, you have this opportunity to help people find their strengths and weaknesses and how they relate to other individuals. And I just find that super rich, and also, them modeling for each other, like what's coming up now, what's coming up for this person, and what's coming up for the next person, and what triggers one person to respond in another way. And you just have that opportunity. It's really like kind of sitting in this delicious soup when you're working with a group.
It's also watching your own, whatever it is, unworkable behavior, somebody else do it, and you see it from the outside. It's like, oh, yeah, that's not going to work. Yeah. It's really powerful. You can be an individual and hear it over and over again and acknowledge it over and over again, but literally watching it happen, very different. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's very, I don't know, in a strange way, it's validating, and it creates compassion. If you're in a group with someone else and you see them struggle with the exact same thing that you struggle with, exactly the way you struggle with it, and you have compassion for them, it flips into compassion for you, I think, personally.
I would agree.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say,
it's helpful for the clinician also. Like when I'm advising or training others in this therapy, one of the things that's really helpful is the idea that these processes are everywhere and with all our behavior. And so that means that you don't have to treat each moment as the only opportunity to work on something. So I'm talking about kind of clinical timing. And so let's say something comes up in group and an individual is super, super, super stuck. Sometimes I think it's okay to really make that very clear to other members of the group, and the cost of that, even if in that moment I might not succeed in helping that particular group member get unstuck, there's going to be lots of opportunities to do that. Meanwhile, the group as a whole is learning a ton. And so that's one of the reasons I love group work, is because it's there's so many different ways to get at these skills and build them up.
Mm-hmm. And I love the experiential exercises in group. I mean, they just come to life. They're just, and as Darrah was saying, piggybacking off of that, it's the opportunity for observing the behavior and connecting and having compassion and having self-compassion, because you're finding out that people are going through what you're going through in your life as well. It's just so rich.
One of the things that I hear a lot from people who are learning ACT is when we're talking at this level of I don't want to say, I'll say mastery, like,
yeah,
that it feels intimidating, like I'm never going to get there. So one of the things I'd ask us to talk about today is when we have had groups blow up in our face, when we've stumbled, when we staggered,
Oh, yeah.
I think that would be really helpful for people to hear too. I don't know what y'all think about that,
but I think that those can create the best moments. I mean, I can think of many instances where it's just not happening, or nothing is happening. And to be able to stop and say, you know what, this feels really off to me. Does it feel off to you? What do you think is happening here? Is there anything that's not being said? Or I feel like I'm just like failing today. That's the thought that's showing up for me. I'm wondering what your experience is. And in that moment, if you think about it, all these courses, they're all in there. Contacting the present and noticing and diffusing from thoughts, being willing to have it, and because of commitment and values, being willing to lean in and put that in the room. So it's impossible to really have a bad group if you are putting that in the table in a really transparent way and modeling. It's a great modeling opportunity.
It is, and I've had moments when, like a lot of times I'll like to try to do metaphors on the fly. And sometimes those work out great, and then sometimes they're just like...
they tank.
And then, as Darrah was saying, just bringing that in the room and saying, I'm noticing my thoughts about how this didn't communicate what I meant to communicate to you. And it is a wonderful, wonderful modeling opportunity. And I know that group members oftentimes in the beginning will talk to the leaders and say, well, you guys have your lives together. And we're like, oh, yeah. No. And you will figure out that we are the same in our struggles.
Yeah.
I had this, so I've run a number of different ACT groups in really, really different settings. Inpatient settings, outpatient settings with super marginalized people who are paying out of pocket like a fee for service for the group. And I've had this experience happen a couple of times. And the first time that it happened, I remember in the moment thinking, I am such a garbage therapist. Like, this is so unprofessional that I don't have my shit together right now. And it happened, the first time that this ever happened, I think it happened about 6 or 8 sessions into a long-term outpatient like management treatment that I was working in. And I remember the group members in that scenario were actually modeling the processes themselves. Like, as I knew that I was like frustrated, having a bad day, irritable and tired, like I saw them modeling the processes. And I had this thought like, oh my God, like they could be running this group. And since I've had that experience, I don't want to say like it doesn't happen all of the time and it doesn't happen in every group that I run, but there's inevitably, once in a while, this just happened. The last time I'm thinking of it happened a couple of years ago. Exact same situation, totally different group dynamic. and somebody in the group needed something, and I just don't think I was 100% able to show up to that. And it was the perfect storm. Co-facilitator was super sick, had to leave the group early. Like, God bless them, like they had shown up for the group, but they needed to leave early. And, I had this thought like, oh, we shouldn't be in this group tonight. Like, this is just a write-off. An issue comes up in the group, and group members are right there just in the moment, like actually modeling these things. And I had just going back a couple of years ago, I actually had the forethought or the insight in the moment to actually be able to label it and say, I'm really proud of what's happening here in this group, like seeing you folks model this.
Nice.
I want to circle back around to, I mentioned before how, like if you have diffusion day, and now I've actually run groups like that because they were very psychoeducational, and we wanted people to sort of understand the ACT model. We don't always do that with clients or with groups. But that's the way we set it up, that we wanted psychoeducation because they were going to be with us just for 3 weeks, and then we wanted them to be on their own and learn more about ACT and go out and continue to grow after they've left our group. So you can set it up to have those specific core processes, the focus, but you must be able to keep yourself open to the other core processes to show up, because they will. And you wanted to address them. And to Darrah's point, you'll have multiple opportunities throughout the group to be able to do that. So if you let one slide, like one of my trainees was showing me a tape, and they missed an opportunity to connect what the person was talking about to sophist context. I'm like, that's okay, it'll happen again. You'll get that opportunity again. That.
This isn't the one moment to work on.
Right. This isn't the one time sophist context is going to show up today.
So if I were a new to group therapist, and I was new to ACT and new to group, and I kind of got sucked into doing a lecture group. I mean, I hear this a lot from consultees. I'm standing there, I'm talking, no one else is. Everybody should basically taking notes because I'm lecturing. How might you help someone step out of that, especially if they are doing a psychoeducational kind of group? Because what I'm hearing you say, Joann, is it's not just showing them, it's not just knowing that, it's also knowing how, and that gets blended together for you.
That's right. Yeah. So looking at the process over the content of what's happening, and if you do the psychoeducational group, it's a little easier to kind of get sucked into of what's happening in the room.
Yeah. Well, what if you're not sure that you can see processes yourself? Like you're brand new, maybe both to ACT and to groups. What if you don't know that you can see the processes reliably?
Darrah is fantastic at talking about this, so I don't want to.
Cool.
I want to bring her into this conversation because I love the way she talks about content versus process.
Actually, just back up a little bit, because these days I'm finding it helpful to make the distinction between explicit and non-explicit work on the processes. Nice. Because the behavior's there all the time. And so you might have decided that today you're going to explicitly talk about, say, diffusion, but that doesn't mean that the other things are out of the room. They're going to be there constantly. And so I might be doing all sorts of things around focus context or willingness or so on, even though the designated explicit topic is, say, diffusion. And I think that helps. It is also helpful to think of this is not about information transfer. This is about skills development. So even if you're, say, giving a talk, you could be talking about this model while meantime modeling and putting things it experientially into the room. It's just more.
Oh no, we're losing We're losing you, Darrah. I'm so sorry. We just lost that last part when you were talking about making it an experiential model
Oh,
in the room.
yeah. So I might not do a bunch of experiential exercises with something like that, but I am aware that in this moment, those processes are in the room. In the moment, I am somewhere on the continuum with all of them. And at any point, I can draw upon that as I'm getting this information and this model across.
Could I share a bit of an anecdotal story about that? Would that be okay with the three of you?
Yeah, please.
So I hope it's okay to disclose, like, I got to read your book, Darrah and Joann, before it came out. The two of you know this. I totally fell in love with it. And what you were just talking about right there, Darrah, is something that I actually shared with my co-author, Jessica, and we created a protocol based on that idea.
Really have.
Yeah, for real. So the protocol is ACT for neonatal intensive care units, but it's for the parents whose children are inpatients who are in the neonatal intensive care unit. And so what we were doing is we were having some pilot conversations about how we were going to run this grant funded project. And one of the things that we came up with was these parents are super stressed. They have their very vulnerable children in an incredibly difficult situation that they're living, that they're breathing day in and day out. And the last thing that they're going to want is us doing psychoeducation, talking about concepts or any intellectual heady kind of stuff. And so we kind of banked on that section, the non-explicit psychological flexibility training. I don't think it was an entire chapter, but it was a whole sort of subchapter in the book. And so we actually created a modular group influenced based on that. And it's been working out.
How did it go?
Real bad. No kidding. Our licenses are suspended.
The tarring and the feathering, that was really hard. I hated that.
It's been going really great. And it's interesting because the group is showing effect with the parents. But what's really interesting is that the parents are taking ownership over these groups now. So they feel like they're living the work without being peer-reviewed ACT trainers or without being behavior analysts or psychologists or social workers or marriage and family therapists. And they're now coming back and volunteering as peer support and running these groups for other parents who are in the neonatal intensive care unit. It's a really interesting, I think, powerful idea that we could run groups in this way, that the processes that are at the heart of the work speak so loudly for it that, you could do it without sort of stereotypical, if you will, sort of psychoeducation kind of therapy type of work.
And I know that I can tell when it's happening, and I bet you all have had this experience too, is long before you have really explicitly explored self as context or diffusion, someone in the group will start talking a little differently. Like, I had the thought last night that my wife is a nag.
Yeah.
Now, that's different.
Yeah.
That's really different. And that's how I know that, okay, something is being transferred here and being soaked in.
Absolutely. For those of you who are listening, or if you're watching, the camera was, the cut was probably to Darrah, so you missed Joann Steinwag's, Joann Wright, myself. We're just nodding the whole time.
Bobblehead dolls. Yeah. I want to ask something to you all, what you think about this. My experience of doing ACT is, if I'm not myself personally in ACT world, ACT space, it's very unlikely that the work is going to go well at all. So even if the session's blowing up in front of me, I can step back into appreciation, surface contact, acceptance, mindful, present moment myself. And that's something that tends to orient me and ground me when I'm working. Do you all experience the same thing?
I'm going to have to admit that
I think that
I was going to say my mic kind of cut out there for a second, or my earbuds cut out for a second there, so I couldn't really hear the question well. So, Darrah, if you want to take it, and then I can kind of figure out what it was.
I can repeat it.
the L train went by, but I think I caught it. It also gives me a chance to answer the other question you had, Joann, around how to help people notice the processes.
Yeah.
I'm really comfortable these days saying that if you aren't embracing this work yourself, I know you can effective act, because it will guide you again and again and again. So part of this is learning how to find and identify those processes. And I think the simplest kind of most immediate way is to stop and say, what am I experiencing?
Right.
What am I experiencing in this moment? And that includes the chatter in the mind, the feeling in the body, the emotions, and then it's like expanding that to this group. Like, what's happening in this group as a whole? And that's out of content.
Yeah.
And the good news is we're only talking just a handful of processes that are very intermingled and entwined. And the other thing I want to say to folks that are in this learning curve is that it's steep for sure, but I feel that it's kind of short. In other words, and I bet others can have had this experience, when comes a point where all this, not suddenly, you realize that these pieces, you understand how they fit together.
Yes.
You have this sense of
world altering when you get there, right?
It's
awesome.
And
yeah.
Freeing. The number of things that a very seasoned clinician has told me, I feel more free in my work than I have ever felt in my life. I can't even count. And that's folks who sometimes have this notion that now they're going to be constrained and they don't get to use all their years of experience. And no, far from it. It's more that you'll come out of this with a sense of, oh, this is why that thing I do is effective.
Yeah.
And this might not be the best option right now because it works against what I'm trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
Really nice clinical guideline around some decision making. But I will agree that initial moving from what you might normally, like in your thoughts about something to into the process is different. But that is kind of my take on how to get there most quickly.
Is that something that any of you struggle with? Like, I find that when I'm training folks in ACT, or when I have consultees who maybe have done a sort of cursory sort of introduction to ACT, and we start talking about looking at it from a more like getting out of content in more of a process way, it starts to take a bit of a scientific bend. And some of the feedback that I get, and I don't think it's negative feedback, but it's just sort of this insight that people have where they'll say something like, whoa, so I thought that ACT was just like some really cool, like nice, warm, like acceptance exercises and some mindfulness. Like I didn't realize it was all this like kind of geeky kind of, okay, you're reinforcing, you're nodding your head. So that's making me feel less weird, right?
Yeah.
So I will say that I want my trainees to know RFT. I mean, I just think that
Totally.
you don't get to what ACT really does and what it's all about unless you understand RFT. And I have trainees coming to me saying, I've been doing it for 2 or 3 years, and they have read just maybe a couple of cursory books, or even some self-help books. and think that they understand ACT. And I really want to encourage people who are learning ACT to get to know RFT. It will open up what we're doing here with this model so much better.
And I would put my plug in for learning behavior analysis and learning theory as well. I don't think you can understand RFT if you don't really understand learning theory. I couldn't. I mean, I remember reading the first RFT book and having this experience of understanding every word in the sentence and having no idea what they're talking about. None. You know?
Yep.
Because I didn't have the conceptual framework. You know, I couldn't think of thoughts as behavior. I didn't even know what behavior was. I didn't have that idea. Go ahead.
I don't think I've ever shared this with anybody. My honest reaction, like learning, because you have to keep in mind, I like to joke about this. I came by ACT honestly. Like I came from the back door of, RFT supporting psychological flexibility. Like it was the theory that I was using to support the yoga evidence that I was collecting for my master's thesis. And I remember reading the RFT stuff and the thought that I had, and I may have even shared this, I don't think I've ever shared this rather out loud, is this is written in such a classist way. It's like this other language, right? Like, this is the secret science language that only we have access to. And I was like, this is so classist. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. I remember sending Kelly Wilson there. I had this cartoon that it had the image was these people on doing they were writing on a chalkboard, and it was all these really arcane mathematical symbols. And the punchline was, this theory becomes so complex you can only discuss it using interpretive dance. And I remember sending that to Kelly Wilson. He was like, oh, okay, well, all right. I think for him, it wasn't like that. I mean, for him, it was just like he grew up in that. But for someone who comes from outside of that realm, it's like so bizarre. You know,
it's very bizarre.
Really interpretive dance, you know?
I think what we're talking about is important, and I think we're kind of moving toward discussing, the science, scientific underpinnings, and that's very, very important. And as I said, my trainees need to know RFT. However, for the beginners who are listening to this, who might feel a little distancing from what we're talking about right now, like, whoa, this is exactly what I'm worried about. I think going back to what Darrah was talking about and opening up in that group room and connecting to what you're experiencing right now, and then getting those group members talking. And once they start talking, and if you start thinking about the core processes, you'll just notice what's showing up and let that guide you.
The other thing is so simple, but it's so key and particularly challenging for me, which is just slow down. Stop.
What a great sentiment.
I don't know about you, but for me, I'm a little hyper anyway, and I get excited about this stuff, and the whole, I was always raised, very interested in people pleasing and performing and making everybody happy. So all that stuff just comes in an exaggerated way in a group setting. So for me, it's so important to know that, and know that that's what might be floating around, and to just stop. It's just because someone asks a question doesn't mean I have to answer it like that. I can actually just slow everything down. Again, pause, say, okay, what? And you can say that, Sam. You're just pausing for a moment.
I have on more than one occasion. I get so enthusiastic, like you said there. I get like very worked up because when talking about it, I just get excited. And I've noticed many, many times I lose my group because I'm in my own little world, doing ACT. I'm like, oh, we're doing ACT. This is so awesome. I love this. This is fantastic. And then I look around and I've completely lost them.
We meaning me.
Yes. And
the royal we.
Right. And then powering down and saying, hey, did I lose you there? you know? Yeah, you did. Okay.
That's a cue for me. If I'm talking a lot, I try to stop and take a look, because chances are something like that is happening.
Yeah. I found as I get older as a clinician, 90% of what I say,
Oh, I was just going to say, being transparent right there is such a great way to further the work. So, you know what? I'm going to pause for a minute. I notice I'm really kind of amped. And I said, I've noticed I really want you all to get this. I'm excited about it. And I notice that I'm working really hard to make that happen. What are you experiencing?
Can I pause for just a second here? Because Darrah just did a little piece of act right there with her language. I'm noticing. Just in that little way of phrasing things, not I am, but I'm noticing. We got self as contexting right there, and acceptance and diffusion, right in that little phrase right there. It's not complicated. Yeah, go ahead.
That's that difference between explicit and maybe not explicit. Because I feel like I'm working on self as context from our first session. In word choice, for instance, or modeling. Even though I might not explicitly, and I will probably never use that term in some groups, but explicitly talk about that ability for a while, that is an example of how we are in fact working on all these processes throughout the therapy.
Mm-hmm. Do you all think that if you ask a process question or frame a process question, you are eliciting self as context and
That's
diffusion?
an interesting question.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So maybe that's why those process questions and those process reflections in therapy in general are so powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They definitely
Would you be willing to give an example, Joann? I'm just thinking for our listeners who may not know what you mean by like a process question.
So earlier in our conversation, I think it was Darrah talking about kind of the group going sideways and her stopping and saying, I noticed that we're not really making a comment about what was happening, and then asking the group, do you notice? What do you notice? What do you see? Do you understand what I'm saying? You kind of have to come out of the looking from something to looking at something to even answer the question.
All aboard?
I was thinking where my mind's going. I'm not quite sure if this is. I'm just going to speak without censoring. So hold on. Like one of the things I like to do, let's say that a group member is just going off. I like to let that go for a moment. And then when there's a break, just say, what is it that you're really wanting us to know?
Yeah.
Or what is it? Why is that important for you to tell us?
Yeah.
And the way it's getting out of the content and into the function, and it forces, it's amazing, 9 times out of 10, if not 10 out of 10, it takes the person back a little bit because they're so in the content.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, what is it? What is the function of this communication?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would always say that doesn't self-as context always have to be tucked in?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I don't think you can you can't be aware without it.
I don't know, it's possible for it not to. The person might not be far enough along to say, I can contact this self that's having this moment and that is having this thought and that is now considering what the function of my communication was. They may not be there, but that ability is being built, I think, to even be able to pull out of the cognitive thought stream enough to say, what is happening for me and why am I wanting?
Right. I'm just noticing, I don't know if you all are noticing this, listeners, Darrah's language is very, very acty. Totally. I'm noticing as you're talking to us right now, you are actually in self as contexting. I'm having the thought. I'm
I,
noticing. Yeah.
I don't even realize that.
Right.
So
Yeah. There's some
it
really
helps.
cool YouTube videos for Kirk Strozal where he's doing these really short little videos, vignettes on YouTube. And you can watch him. He walks into the room. They're only like 10 minutes long. And he starts talking. You know that one I'm talking about, Tim? Where he's talking in self is contexting, and the client all of a sudden, like midstream, starts mimicking.
Mhm.
And you can see that it's not just the client mimicking, it's that shift is actually occurring where the client begins to look at their experience in this very, very elegant way. Yeah. If you all have a chance, go look at those YouTube videos. Kirk Strozal. Kirk, amazing stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty phenomenal.
While I'm listening, my mind keeps going to that we've got, a lot of beginners. And
Yes.
it's kind of the second time I've come back to feeling that I hope we're not cutting out people who are beginners, because I know for a lot of beginners, self as context can be a really scary core process of the model, and they get kind of lost and confused in it. And how do I find that self as context coming out in the room? I'm just not even sure how that's happening. And so, a lot of times I'll tell my early trainees, just look for things like, that's just not me. If you're inviting people to do an experience, and they're like, that's just not me. That they're eliciting that the conceptualized self. I'm not the person who does that. And so it could be as simple as that, the things that you're looking for in that room.
So if you did have someone in group say, you're asking them to participate and they just say, oh, that's just not me. Mm-hmm. How might you proceed? How might either of you proceed?
So I might talk to them about, where did that story come from? Let's explore what you mean by that's just not me. And then kind of shift over into an observer self as opposed to a conceptualized self. That's kind of a really quick and dirty explanation of what you might do. But
would you ever say to the person, okay, it's not you, could you fake it and do it badly anyway?
I would be more interested in having them come into contact with that story that they're telling themselves about who they are. And so I think I would go down
you broke out a little bit.
Oh, and the train didn't even go by this time. I think I would go down the path of, that where does that story come from? That story of who you are. And see if we can affect a shift.
Well, and it's interesting because that right there is one of those it's like a process question, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a beautiful example of there are so many ways to go here. You can do so many different things with a comment like that. And who's to say we can't? The only way we would know which one was best if we could roll out every single way. Yeah.
Right.
So like with something like that, depending on what you were working with, if let's say you were trying to really build up the self as process abilities, you could take something like that, that's just not me, and just say, oh, how is that a thought that shows up for you often? Or what other thoughts show up when that one does? Mm-hmm. And then there's diffusion in there, you're starting to build that ability. You don't even have to get into the content of that at all, but say, okay, because what you're looking at, like if we look at it from an ACT framework, having a self-concept isn't a problem, it's the rigid attachment. You hear it all the time. I'm this, I'm that, oh, I'm just very articulate, Something like, I'm just not good in groups, I'm just not very good at expressing myself, or I'm shy. You can immediately go to the function of that. You could talk about noticing that and what other sorts of things come along with it. You can do an experiential exercise. You could do any number of things depending on what you decide you want to move forward in that moment. And I think
makes it challenging.
is that there are so many options. And that's what I want to say to people, you know what, it's probably all.
Yeah. And looking at the function of that behavior, is it avoidant for them? Is this just an old story that they tell themselves often? Taking a look at how that functions for them.
Or are we seeing a behavior of flexibility in action for someone who never says no and never refuses?
Exactly.
That's a massive towards move. That's a massive flexibility move.
Fantastic. Like, that's another thing in a moment like that, you say, wow, how great that you just shared that then.
Mm-hmm. And what I want the listeners to notice right now is a few things. And one of that is, you know, how many ways we can go at this. And that we have been talking for the last several minutes about somebody simply saying in group, that's not me. Now think about how many of those moments happen in group. I'm getting chills thinking about this right now. How many moments you have in group like that. And how many different ways you can go after that and process that from an ACT perspective.
So I'm going to play a little bit of a devil's advocate with you, Joann. I think for someone who's learning group and learning ACT, that vast choice might be really overwhelming and daunting. So I think it's great. I love that kind of, I can go anywhere, but if I don't know where I'm going to begin with, it's kind of scary. So if you were going to sort of help someone enter into that vast arena, how might you do that?
So when I'm working with trainees, they do struggle with that a lot in the very beginning. You know, they really are like, well, you told me to do it this way. So we were talking about choices of how to chase this down. And I think some of the ways is, first of all, get that RFT foundation and get down the core processes so you have a really good understanding of it. And then the choices will just flow from the moment. And, you know, you might go back and say, I could have made a different choice there. You know, in fact, when I was talking about how I would have chosen to go after that's just not me, and I said, oh, this is the way I would do it, I also had like 4 or 5 other ways of going at it. And then Darrah jumped in and gave some ways she would go after. I'm like, oh yeah, those are fantastic. And so having that flexibility, coming back to the flexibility, coming back to doing the ACT core processes, what's happening for yourself. What's happening for yourself if you have that moment that you have that chatter in the back going, I would have handled that differently next time, and recognizing that that's just part of the process of being a group leader.
I want to come back to something you've been saying a lot, Joann. Learn RFT, know RFT. And I'm wondering if for people who may not have access to someone like yourself or Darrah, how would you suggest someone learn RFT? It's daunting. It's overwhelming.
You know, so folks, I don't know, are we promoting books here? Okay, I think Nicholas Turnicke's book is really great. I learned from the Purple Book, as we call it. I think that's a badge of honor for those of you who have read it, to have made it through that. But it is very difficult for beginners in particular. And so I would say Nicholas Turnicke's RFT book. Also, Eric Fox's Foxy Learning is a website that you can learn RFT from.
Yeah, I highly recommend that.
Yeah, Foxy Learning's great.
Darrah, what are your thoughts?
I wanted to mention them before, but I didn't know if we could plug.
Absolutely. This is about resources for people finding
and we'll put all the links to the stuff in the show notes.
And Nicholas is going to be on the show sometime in February, I think, right?
Everybody tune in to Nicholas.
Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think fortunately there are more and more resources, ways to learn. I was just contemplating my own learning curve. For me, it was really something that just kept glimmering in and out. Like I would kind of get it and then find that I didn't. And it wasn't until I started trying to explain it to family members and such that it really started to come together. And then really writing about it is when it really solidified for me. So I can certainly understand the struggle. I want to just put a little pitch in there to second Joann W, your comment on the importance of it. For me, it's the difference between just asking someone to accept that thoughts are just thoughts, although I would never say it quite like that. You know, that thoughts are thoughts, and the understanding that in fact,
Oh, we lost her. Can you repeat?
Yeah, that in fact, what we do, even this thought about myself, say this extremely painful, is something that was learned. And it is something that I am producing in the moment. It's a product. And it has a sting. It has a bite to it, but it's not true. Profound. You know, and that's what, for me, really what I understood.
Oh, you'll have to say that again, Darrah. We're losing you.
Learning acquisition and sort of.
Oh no.
Let's all try.
Then the therapy
Oh,
arising.
sorry. You'll have to
all this
rewind,
mention-
Darrah. I'm so sorry. We lost you.
Okay, from where? Where shall I rewind? I don't know where you lost me.
Something about writing. You're talking about writing and then explaining to families. Explaining to families.
Actually, I got you up until you were talking about why it's important to learn RFT and knowing the difference between just learning a diffusion technique. Okay.
Thank you, dear. But it gives me a chance to say this better. Wrestle with it. Wrestle with it. Because it is it's kind of heady stuff. But I also want to say it's worth wrestling with. Because when it lands, the implications are so profound.
Absolutely.
Like I can't really ever take anything I say about myself that seriously, or someone else for that matter. I'll use it. But when I understand how we as human beings are in this thing, and we've learned to do this, and then to relate to our thought processes in a certain way, it changes how I view everything.
I had one of my trainees recently came in with a fair amount of background. His university had a couple of classes and he was well read. And I started my didactic training with RFT. And he came out of that training and he just went, wow! He's like, it just, it is so, so important. But I kind of wish that it was like somehow mandatory that if you're going to be doing ACT, you need the RFT first.
Yeah. How many of you are behaviorally trained, Darrah? Joann, what was your background? Behaviorism?
Mm-hmm.
Darrah, was that true for you? Okay, that was not my background.
Same.
At all. So I think that when you come from when you're kind of bred up in that community, it's so much easier to understand RFT. The idea that, like I said earlier, that thoughts are behavior.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and thoughts don't have causal status. What? You know, it's astonishing, right?
Yeah.
So I think for folk this is deeply alien, people whose perception of the world and reality is essential realism. You know, things are things, thoughts are things. It's hard. Don't you think, Tim? I mean, it was really difficult.
Can I tell my grad school seminar story?
Yeah, sure.
I gave a presentation on a seminar presentation. So I picked some really, what I thought were just absolutely beautiful readings. I gave a presentation on using a functional assessment, like rather than a traditional DSM diagnosis. And I gave this, I thought, just killer presentation on how a radical behavioral stance was more respectful to people. It was more inclusive. It looked at them in their environment. It was an ecological way of talking about people's behavior. So I finished this presentation, and it's a seminar class. So like, I'm assuming, that people have done the readings and they're going to be engaged and they're going to have fun questions or interesting challenges, like crickets, like
Crickets.
just crickets.
Yes.
And I was so excited to give this and I'm standing there, and my prof, who was,
And this is for a group of social workers too, right? We're
Yeah,
all
social
trained
work
up in
grad school.
contextual thinking, right? So but let's do
social
that,
work
right?
grad school. And I remember this prof who was so kind and so sweet. She's sitting in the front row, and she looks back to the class and says, "Look, if you have any questions for Tim, now is the time to ask, because you will never meet someone for the rest of your career that has an interest in this." Isn't that incredible?
Yeah, and now you have a whole community of people who are interested in it.
Isn't that funny?
So can I go back to your comment, Joann, about how this can, and about how overwhelming this can be, and the fact that there are so many options is part of the challenge, because I heartily agree. But here's the thing. It's helpful to remember that in many ways, this is fairly straightforward. We want to help people get out of the grip of problem, language, I guess we could say, that thoughts that then influence their behavior. We want to loosen that up. We want to free people up so that they can live the way that they want to be living. And the main key here is that they're going to be taking that stuff with them, that shorthand for act, hold, and move. Mm-hmm. So that means if you're in a group, we kept using that example of somebody says, "That's just not me." You can do an opportunity to move something forward up.
Darrah, you're cutting out again.
It could be diffusion, selfish context, just like, let's just sit with that a moment. Okay? That's self. Can you hear me okay? It's unstable connection. Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so there's another example of just sitting with it. You could all let that go, focus on something else. If you think about, there are just a few key build, and you are moving your group in that direction to be able to notice their experience, see it for what it is, and then make choices that are in line with how they want to be in the world. It simplifies things.
Yeah.
And then there's going to be many, many, many opportunities to pull something out and work on it, either because you decided to focus on it as a topic, or because something shows up in the room that's just a great example of something. But that doesn't mean you have to catch everything.
Right, exactly. And I think I'm glad you brought up like hold and move. So if you're doing that, if you just break it down to hold and move, if you break it down to open, aware, and engaged, the 3 pillars of ACT, you might find that a little less cumbersome than the 6 core processes. And so I'm glad you brought that up, Darrah. It's great.
Yeah.
I have something to kind of add to this that I think is a fun topic that occurs to me from both the ACT, like Learning ACT for Group Treatment, but also from your advanced ACT book, Darrah. And Joann Wright, this is something that you and I have talked about on a number of different occasions, which is if you actually learn this implicit process work, if you will, if you learn the nerdy science stuff in a way that's usable to you, in a way that's functional, if you will, it empowers you to be able to apply this anywhere, anytime. Like even when you're a podcast guest having to deal with like Tim Gordon and Joann Steinbach's, you can even use this stuff. But like,
so you can be really present and enjoy every moment of it.
But I'm just thinking, like, there's an infinite number of adaptation that you could create if you wanted, like, so the yoga work that I do came from creating a group protocol that is teaching a yoga class in an act consistent way.
And there's a book coming out that Tim's written with Jessica Borsha around this exact thing, which is just a fabulous book. It's coming out when? Tim?
In the spring through New
In the
Harbinger.
spring.
Yeah.
It's really good. It's really good.
But like, for example, thank you, but getting people to do like a challenging posture and using that as an opportunity to do discrimination training, right?
Yeah, exactly. Tim sent me an advanced copy and I was reading it. And I was like, whoa, this is totally act consistent. Like corpse pose. How would corpse pose be an embodied way of doing acceptance and mindfulness in present moment? Just that one thing is so powerful. Yeah.
Joann, if I was a dog, my tail would be wagging right now.
You are a dog. You're a golden retriever.
Totally.
You're a golden
But
retriever.
that's something that totally occurs to me, like based on the conversations that we're having here, is like, yeah, if one of our listeners who may be intimidated by some of this more sciencey kind of stuff, or, oh my gosh, there's so much more to ACT than just, some techniques and some psychoeducation. This seems a bit extreme. It's like, yeah, and it frees you up to do a lot of really cool things and to adapt and have fun, I would argue.
I don't remember who said this to me when I was learning this. He said, it was a guy, I think. He said, if you want to be a really good baker, you can learn a bunch of different recipes and follow the recipes, or you can learn chemistry and understand how the ingredients work together. And I think that was right, I've been following recipes. And this is different, to be able to understand. I could make up my own recipe. Does that make sense, what I'm saying there? Yeah. Right. Anyway.
A lot of times I'll say to people too when they're learning is, you have all the ingredients. So you have all the ingredients for the cake, but you haven't made the cake. So here is a bunch of ingredients just sitting on a shelf. And so how are you going to incorporate those into baking that cake?
That's a great metaphor. I'm totally down with that.
Good one, yeah. Yeah, I like that too. And understanding how metaphor actually works and what it's doing. And like, we're right there. What we just did there, that was RFT. That's using language with all its strength, which I think is awesome.
What do we want to say about group work? Like, does anybody have any sort of anecdotes that you want to share about why group work is relevant? Like, I love in your book, the two of you talk about group work being like evocative, cost effective. I mean, yes, act on steroids. Totally agree. But are there other things that we want to share?
I have a really great anecdote. And my group was an anxiety IOP. And we were doing passengers on the bus. And one of the group members killed someone in a car accident, killed his girlfriend in a car accident, and the car accident was his fault. And so as he was coming up with his thoughts, and he was assigning them to the different passengers, the different group members, he stopped at one and said, "I'm a murderer." And it was such a powerful moment. People started breaking down and crying. Both of them were crying. The guy he assigned, "I'm a murderer," said, "Man, I can't do that. Don't make me say that to you." And he said, "I need you to." And as they went around, and he let the passengers on the bus, and he let on, "I'm a murderer." And he said, "Have a seat." He said that was one of the most freeing moments in his life.
My God.
It was amazing.
Wow.
It was amazing. It was transformative for so many people in that room.
It sounds like including you.
Yes, absolutely.
For those of you who aren't watching the video, Joann's a little teary right now, just a little teared up. Very cool. Yeah.
It's even touching me in this moment. I wasn't there. I don't know this client, but it's, yeah, it's beautiful.
The power of language.
I think that the model offers such a way for people to access compassion, as Joann S. mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. And I think that makes so much sense because we are talking about processes that apply to every single one of us. So it's really, as we all know, it's about the human condition, being human. And so when you're working at that level, I find that it really enables to be with one another in a compassionate way, because it's so clearly, we're so clearly all in the same soup. Because we talk a lot about being compassionate towards each other and listen to your group members compassionately. Well, when you are working at this level, I feel that that is a natural outcome. Because you recognize, you see yourself, you see your own struggles in the other person's struggle, even if topographically it looks completely different. It's the same struggle. So I find that these groups are deeply compassionate, and just as a social setting, we can work against each other socially, and we can also be massive sources of support. And when you're meeting in this place, like the inherent struggle of being human, it's just incredibly potent.
Mm-hmm.
And then the only other thing I would say in answer to your question, Tim, is just to encourage people to really maximize being in a group setting. And for me, that means thinking about the 3 levels that are going on at all times, meaning an individual group member, you might really want them to learn or move along a particular ability, say willingness, for example. And then your group as a whole, you want that whole group to be learning to be manifesting these abilities as a group in terms of how they are functioning as a group. And then you yourself as an individual needs to be in the mix as well. At any moment, all 3 of those things are available to you in terms of information and thinking about what might be a fruitful direction to head. And so for me, it's useful to think anyway about, okay, so here's what's happening with that member, what's happening with the group overall, what's happening with me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's really helpful, I think, yeah. Mm. Tim, do you have any anecdotes of running groups that you think would be helpful to this conversation?
Yeah. One thing that I was taught early on in supervision about ACT was this idea of like just being able to trust the process. And that is something that has really helped me in running mixed groups where we don't have a specific topic and where different people might be facing different kinds of issues. And it's really allowed me to have this idea that, okay, so as a group facilitator, I don't have to come in with a specific anecdote, a specific metaphor, a specific worksheet to use for the day, that we could simply talk about, hey, what are people noticing that shows up in your life that is making things difficult? How do you relate to that stuff? How old are those stories? Mm-hmm. How long have those passengers been on your bus for? And it just opens us up to having conversations in a really in a very relevant way, where I seem more, again, in the soup rather than this sort of objective, disinterested, helping professional. So that's something that has served me really well. And I've noticed that in group work, it is such a personally rewarding. But again, to come back to something that I had said earlier, I see the group members start to model those behaviors and start to live it themselves. Or even when Darrah, I'm noticing even as I'm saying that, Darrah's smiling, right? Like as Darrah was saying earlier, right, where you start to feel those shifts in language. So that's something that I think is unique to group work that I don't experience as much in individual or in couples therapy. And I mean, and you had said earlier, Joann, too, describing this idea of people being able to see, whether it be experiential avoidance or whatever, in action. And I've had the experience where one person who's struggling, who's a totally different socioeconomic status, who's struggling with something completely different than the marginalized single parent who is struggling with a completely night and day different issue, where I've seen each person see similarities in the other's story. So same function, but different topography.
Yeah.
And that like rocks my world when I see that in action.
And I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of times I will see group members, like if they're new, and sometimes the group would be completely different in like age range. And so let's say we happen to have a group and most of them are like emerging adults. And then somebody in their mid 60s joins the group and 15 minutes later, they're pulling me out saying, I have nothing in common with these people. And I stick around, let's see what happens.
Yeah.
And then finding that commonality that you can be from vastly different backgrounds and still find a commonality as human beings. It's amazing.
So I'm talking, what I'm hearing you all talk about is the power of the group, that we're not alone in the room. We're not running the group, we're engaging with the group. And I remember I off and on run groups for people with bipolar disorder. And the worst thing that could ever happen narratively around the group, one woman showed up and she was in a manic episode in the group. And this is the most frightening thing for the members of the group. And she was raging and really, really, really distressed. And the group, I was like gobsmacked. I was like, holy crap, what do I do? And the group handled it so beautifully. It didn't look good on the outside, but on the inside stuff was happening. She raged out of the room. She insulted everyone. She screamed, she yelled. She walked out of the room. And as soon as she walked out of the room, all of the group members looked at each other. And I don't remember exactly how they said it, but they said, this is a person we care about. And that is what she's struggling with. And I was just like, yeah, right? And then when she came back in the next week, it was, the group was just, they just stood there with her. She was humiliated, disgusted with herself. And the group just said, this is our worst nightmare. All of us know what you're talking about. This is who you are. And this is what you struggle with. We get it. And I just,
powerful.
Yeah, I couldn't. There's nothing I could have done that would have made that better. Yeah. So there's this quality of like, Tim, you talked about trusting the process. I think it's also possible to trust the group. Yeah.
Yeah. And that every moment is an opportunity. Again, don't feel like you have to take everyone. I was just thinking of what you were sharing. Do we have time, Tim, we're doing okay?
Oh,
okay.
Yeah. We're doing great.
I do have to say I have a panel discussion in about 15 minutes.
Okay.
We'll wrap up in 15.
Yeah, we'll wrap up.
Okay.
I had this tough situation once where I was invited to do a little act, part of this study going on at UCSF of caregivers of children with autism, so parents. And I cared a lot about this, and I did a lot of prep. And I walked into the room, and there were quite a few. It was a large group, all sitting in a big circle. And I went to my seat, and I guessed that I was standing against a great, big, huge window. And so when people looked at me, you just see the silhouette, and I guess it was glaring. So the group asked me to change seats. So I said, all right. So I proceeded to go towards a seat that someone moved, and there was a seat open there where that wasn't happening. And as I was doing this, a woman walked in who was late to the group. That they had cleared for me. And I walked up, and then someone told her, and I think two people at the same time said, oh, that's, you can't sit there. Darrah's sitting there. And she had to move. And so as I was sitting down, she took her seat, was there for about 5 seconds, and stormed out of the room and left. And I followed her and tried to explain she was having none of it. She had driven 2 hours to get there. This is a highly stressed mom, you know. And I had to go back and start this group of people that I had never met, and, you know. And what I did is just took that opportunity model and this model of that, and I just said, I want to acknowledge what just happened. I said, I imagine we're all experiencing a lot right now. And I said, it's very important in terms of what I'll be talking to you today, that we don't try to make nice or pretend that this didn't happen. I'm personally really upset about it. I have lots of thoughts about a mistake. I feel that I made a mistake, and I'm feeling really badly about it. And I want to just say that I'm capable of having that, and I suggest, you know, is there anything else that you want to share? And we just sat with that for a minute, and then we went on. So I just share that as an example of how this model infuses there. All those times where you're trying to figure, oh no, disaster. Like, I'm still sad about that incident. But you know, it's life, and the act is tucked in there, and we don't have to solve it, but we can use it.
That's really powerful.
Yeah, so upsetting.
You're still upset about it.
Yeah.
I don't mean to try to make nice or to turn that frown upside down, but I just think what a beautifully human moment. And I'm so grateful that you would share that here on the podcast.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, it's such a like, come on, we have all heard this rule before, and whether it was told to you or whether you've heard someone self-report to you that they've heard it right like this, like, you know, you need to be a tabula rasa, a blank slate. You couldn't possibly cry or be vulnerable in a session.
Don't make the therapy about you. Don't make the therapy about you.
Like, WTF, like, what's the function of that? Yeah.
And we have all these wonderful modeling opportunities, and you know, Darrah just demonstrated such an amazing one. And I couldn't imagine doing therapy without having that be a piece of it, you know, for them to understand. And I think, you know, kind of going back to something I said earlier about how group members often think the leaders just really have their shit together, you know, and for us to be like, we're the same, you know, we're the same, we're all in the same soup bowl, you know, and I just couldn't imagine doing therapy with that whole, you know, don't bring yourself into this process. It's like, whoa.
But how many of you all work with grad students or therapists who that really had that beaten into them? I mean, I see a lot of students where there's this incredible shaming. You know, I got obviously upset in session and I failed my client. No, you didn't. Yeah. It's so
this notion that that's what people relate to is smoothness or knowingness. When you think about that's not human. It's the soft part of us. It's the vulnerable part of us that connect. And so I really try to work with my supervisors, saying that's not you being impressive is not where it's at, or even smart, or that's not where it's at. what is going to be the mechanism of change or transformation is that human to human connection. So good news, you're already there.
You know, I want to go back to the anecdote you told us, Darrah, about the woman storming out. My guess is that, you know, you could have stood up there and said that, oh, everyone's having feelings, let's pause. And in this very kind of therapist-y way. And my guess is that is not at all how you did it. You were obviously upset. You were obviously distraught. You were obviously shaken. And you showed that, which is really different.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because you're telling the story, I mean, it still bugs you. It still bothers you that happened.
Oh yeah. Even a feeling of shame, like when I have the image of myself chasing her and trying to get her to talk to me in the elevator, it's like almost a shameful feeling. I feel like crying right now.
Yeah. Right. So I think rather than saying this is a kind of therapist-y way to handle it, the language, you know, how do we all feel about this? Like modeling or not modeling. You're not modeling. You're experiencing and letting people see you experience.
Well said.
Dealing with really hard experience, a really painful, shameful, embarrassing, and continuing, like hold and move. Not stuff and move, but hold and move.
Yeah. Well, and often you can guide yourself a little bit in a group or in any clinical setting. If it's up here and you're trying to transfer information, there's going to be times for that. But really, you want to be in the experience with them. You want to be in an experience with your group, even if you're talking about something. If it feels you're talking, it's time to bring yourself.
Can you say that one more time for posterity, Darrah? I'm so sorry.
Oh, yeah. Well,
just that.
I was thinking of actually one of the first times I did creative helplessness, and I was just so excited about the whole thing, and I think that was coming across. And one of the gals just sat back and just said, "Are you playing with us?" I was shocked because that was not even close to where it was coming from. It helped me understand, like, I need to join them. I need to find a way. And the way for me to do that is what is felt in the, what is here. And then that'll help me, even if I'm talking about something, moving through an exercise, it will help me join. I want to be in an experience, as you just said, Joann. Yes.
And I think I'm thinking about a workshop that I had with Kelly Wilson many years ago, talking about how, you know, deep emotions show up in the smallest of ways. And, you know, I'm thinking about you, Darrah, in that moment of that person storming out, and how that instantaneous deep feeling that's stayed with you since. You know, Kelly asked in the workshop, like, how did you know, if you felt like your parents cared about you and loved you, how did you know that? And I'd say, oh, my mom would kiss my forehead to see if I had a fever. Or my dad would put me to bed at night and he'd say, I'm going to throw you over my shoulder like a sack of potatoes. You know, there are these just tiny moments that evoke big emotions. And that's another thing of paying attention to them and seeing what's going on in those moments. In those moments of lovely emotions like love, and of deep painful ones that we and our group members experience.
You know, it's also interesting in a group when a process happens, then acknowledging it, that right there, right, we just did it. It's much more powerful than explaining it first and then, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you can see after a while when people become very sensitive to that, they'll say, "Oh, right, we just did that thing," or "You just did that thing." Yeah, right. I love this work so much.
This has been a really cool conversation. I can't thank the two of you enough for joining us today and just bringing your real selves to this and putting yourselves out there.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure.
Definitely, My pleasure. Thank you so much for the invite.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. You know, Tim, we have these conversations with these people, and you know, after or during the podcast, we say we have to bring them back.
Yeah.
We've said that with pretty much everybody, but this one for sure, we have to bring them back.
Totally.
This is great. This is wonderful.
All right. Well, thank you to our listeners. Don't forget that you can follow us on Twitter at Act in Context Podcast. Excuse me, at Act in Context. And our email address is actincontextpodcast@gmail.com.
Right.
Please send us in your questions, your feedback, things that you want to hear more about. We would love to have the two of you, Darrah and Joann, on again. This has been a lot of fun. And again, thank you for bringing your whole selves to this.
Yeah.
It was really a great time. I really enjoyed this very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
We did it again, Joann.
We did, and no one came after us to take us away for it either.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this is my stop on the L train. I got to get off at Michigan.
You know, I was thinking it's funny because I brought L trains. I'm brought here by L trains, and Darrah's brought here by tire chains.
Oh, that's really funny.
Tire chains. That's actually a country song, isn't it?
L trains and tire chains, yeah. All right, I have to fly to my panel. Thank you so much, everybody. Love, and this was a blast. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.